The mountains do not care about your plans or your pedigree, or the fact that you decided to take your children out for a weekend of fresh air and bonding. The Great Smoky Mountains have a way of breathing a slow and rhythmic expansion of fog and damp earth that feels less like weather and more like a heavy wet lung pressing down on your chest. I have spent too many years looking at maps that lead to nowhere and staring at photographs of smiling people who simply cease to exist in the space of a single heartbeat. You start to see the patterns after a while, the jagged edges of reality where things just slip through the cracks of the world. It is a specific kind of exhaustion that settles in your marrow when you realize how little we actually know about the ground beneath our boots. The dirt is old and the trees are older, and they have seen thousands of us walk in and never walk out. On June 14, 1969, the Martin family was doing exactly what thousands of other families were doing in the high summer heat of Tennessee. They were at Spence Field, a high-altitude meadow that looks like a slice of heaven until the clouds roll in and turn the world into a gray, featureless void. Bill Martin was there with his sons, including 6-year-old Dennis, a boy with a bright red shirt and a spirit that had not yet been dampened by the complexities of the world. They were part of a larger group, a multi-generational outing that should have been nothing more than a footnote in a family scrapbook. The air was thick with the smell of crushed grass and the distant threat of a summer storm, the kind of afternoon where the hum of insects becomes a physical weight against your eardrums. Dennis was a healthy boy, robust and familiar with the outdoors, not the type to simply wander off and lose his mind. The game was simple, the kind of innocent diversion that has been played by children for centuries. Dennis and his older brother and 2 other boys decided to play a prank on the adults, a quick game of hide-and-seek where they would sneak up on the fathers from different directions. Bill Martin watched his son duck behind a bush, the shock of that red shirt disappearing into the emerald green of the Appalachian brush. It was 4:30 in the afternoon, a time when the sun starts to angle low and the shadows begin to stretch like long dark fingers reaching across the clearing. Dennis was supposed to pop out from the other side, a childish jump scare intended to provoke a laugh and a playful chase. The other boys did exactly that, emerging with shouts and grins, but the spot where Dennis had vanished remained unnervingly still. Bill Martin waited for a few seconds, then a minute, the initial amusement slowly curdling into a cold, sharp needle of anxiety in the pit of his stomach. He called out his son's name, his voice echoing off the surrounding ridges and returning to him unanswered and hollow. He walked over to the bush where he had last seen the red shirt, expecting to find the boy suppressed by a fit of giggles, or perhaps distracted by a toad or a bright stone. There was nothing but the rustle of the wind through the leaves and the oppressive sudden silence of the forest. Within 7 minutes, the father was frantic, tearing through the undergrowth with a desperation that only a parent can truly understand. In those 7 minutes, the world had shifted, and Dennis Martin had been erased from the face of the earth as if he had never been there at all. The search began almost immediately, a chaotic scramble of family members and other hikers who happened to be in the vicinity of Spence Field. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon and the temperature started its inevitable slide into the damp chill of the mountain night, the rangers had been notified. But the mountains had a cruel surprise in store for the searchers, as a massive torrential downpour began to lash the ridges. This was not a gentle summer rain, but a violent, scouring deluge that dumped inches of water in a matter of hours, washing away scent trails and footprints. It felt deliberate, a calculated erasure of any evidence that might have pointed toward the boy's direction of travel. The mud turned into a slick, treacherous slurry, and the creeks rose into raging torrents that cut off entire sections of the park. By the next morning, the scale of the disappearance had triggered one of the largest search and rescue operations in the history of the National Park Service. Hundreds of volunteers, park rangers, and local law enforcement officers flooded the area, their flashlights cutting weak holes in the thick, clinging mist. But then the heavy hitters arrived, and this is where the story takes a turn into the shadow world of official secrecy and unexplained anomalies. The Green Berets and other specialized military units were deployed to the Smokies, ostensibly to assist in the search for a missing 6-year-old boy. It was an unprecedented move, a massive influx of elite soldiers who reportedly conducted their own independent search patterns and refused to coordinate with the civilian authorities. I have talked to men who were there, men who saw these soldiers carrying heavy weaponry and looking for something that was not a lost child. There was a witness, a man named Jack Key, who was hiking with his family several miles away from Spence Field, around the same time Dennis vanished. He reported hearing a sickening, blood-curdling scream that ripped through the woods, a sound of pure terror that didn't sound like a typical animal. Shortly after the scream, Key and his son saw a rough, unkempt man hiding in the bushes, a figure that appeared to be carrying something slung over his shoulder. The man was described as looking wild. perhaps even animalistic, and he moved through the dense vertical terrain with an agility that defied human physics. When Key reported this to the authorities, he was met with a wall of dismissive silence, his testimony buried under a mountain of bureaucratic indifference. It makes you wonder what the official narrative was trying to hide, and why a sighting of a potential kidnapper was treated like a hallucination. The investigation turned up a few tantalizing and terrifying clues that only deepened the mystery of the boy's fate. Searchers found a set of footprints in the deep woods, one barefoot and one wearing a small shoe leading toward a treacherous ravine. But the tracks simply stopped in the middle of a clearing, as if whatever had been making them had been lifted straight up into the air. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood. No torn fabric from that bright red shirt that should have been visible for miles against the green backdrop. The tracking dogs, some of the best in the country, would pick up a scent and then suddenly cower, whining and refusing to move forward as if they had hit an invisible wall of pure dread. It is the kind of behavior that suggests an apex predator, but not one that belongs to the known biological catalog of North America. As the days turned into weeks, the hope of finding Dennis alive evaporated into the humid air of the Tennessee summer. The search was eventually scaled back, leaving Bill Martin to spend the rest of his life wandering those ridges, a ghost of a man looking for a ghost of a boy. The official report remains a sanitized collection of weather data and failed logistics, carefully avoiding the stranger elements of the case. They want you to believe he fell into a creek or was taken by a bear, despite the total lack of physical evidence to support either theory. But bears do not leave behind single shoes and then vanish into thin air, and mountain streams do not swallow red shirts without leaving a single thread behind. There is something else in those woods, something that operates on a frequency we are not tuned to hear until it is far too late. The military presence in the Dennis Martin case has never been satisfactorily explained, and the reports from the Green Berets remain classified to this day. Why would the government send specialized combat troops to find a missing child in a national park unless they knew they were dealing with something more dangerous than a lost boy? There are whispers of underground facilities of strange lights seen in the sky above the ridges, and of a population of something not quite human living in the deep caves of the Smokies. You look at the map and you see the clusters, the places where people disappear in exactly the same way, leaving behind nothing but questions and a lingering sense of malice. The terrain is a predator, and sometimes the predator has a face that we are not permitted to see or understand. We are left with the silence of Spence Field and the memory of a red shirt that vanished in the blink of an eye. The Dennis Martin case is a wound that never healed, a reminder that the boundary between our world and the unknown is as thin as a mountain mist. You can walk into the woods a whole person and become a statistic before your heart beats 10 more times. The earth is hungry, and it does not distinguish between the innocent and the guilty, the young or the old. All that remains is the cold reality that some things are taken and never returned, kept by the shadows that dwell in the places we were never meant to go. This pattern of sudden trace-free disappearance is not an isolated incident confined to the 1960s or the Appalachian Range. In 1999, 3-year-old Jaryd Atadero vanished while hiking with a group in the Roosevelt National Forest in Colorado, only for his clothing to be found years later on a nearly inaccessible cliffside. Much like Dennis, Jaryd was there one moment and gone the next, leaving behind a trail that defied logic and a search effort that yielded only more questions. These cases are the dark echoes of a world we think we have conquered, but which still holds secrets that can swallow a life without leaving a ripple. Sleep well if you can, and remember that the woods are never as empty as they seem. The office is quiet tonight, save for the hum of a dying fluorescent bulb and the steady rhythmic clicking of a radiator that sounds like bone tapping against wood. I have been staring at these topographical maps of the Great Smoky Mountains for 6 hours, tracing the contour lines with a finger that has grown numb from the cold. There is a specific kind of darkness that lives in the Appalachian Range, an ancient, suffocating weight that seems to swallow the very light from your flashlight. It is a place where the trees grow too close together, and the fog rolls in like a living shroud, hiding things that have no business existing in our modern world. We like to think we have mapped the wilderness, that we have conquered the unknown with our global positioning systems and our satellite imagery, but the maps are a lie. They show us the surface, the skin of the earth, but they tell us nothing of the digestive tract that lies beneath the moss and the limestone. June 14th, 1969, was a Saturday that began with the promise of a perfect mountain afternoon. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming mountain laurel, a humid heat that made the shade of the hemlocks feel like a sanctuary. Bill Martin had taken his sons, including 7-year-old Dennis, to Spence Field for a Father Day weekend camping trip that was supposed to be a rite of passage. They were joined by the Martin grandfather and another family, the Trens, creating a group of 7 people in a high mountain meadow. Spence Field is a beautiful open expanse, a bald that offers sweeping views of the surrounding ridges, but it is bordered by some of the most unforgiving terrain in the eastern United States. The grass was high, swaying in a light breeze that carried the distant rumble of a coming storm, a storm that would later be described as a biblical deluge. Dennis was a vibrant boy wearing a bright red shirt that should have made him visible for a mile against the deep greens of the mountain grass. In a playful moment, typical of a young child, he and the other boys decided to play a trick on the adults, a simple game of hide-and-seek that would end in a lifetime of grief. The plan was for the boys to split up and sneak around the adults from different directions, jumping out to surprise them with a shout and a laugh. Dennis went behind a single, large bush, a small island of foliage in the sea of grass, intending to circle back. He was no more than 30 feet away from his father and the other men, a distance so short you could throw a stone and hit him. But when the other boys emerged from their hiding spots, Dennis did not follow, and the laughter died in the mountain air as a heavy, unnatural silence settled over the field. Bill Martin waited for a few minutes, calling his son name, expecting the red shirt to pop up from behind a ridge or a tree trunk at any second. But the seconds turned into minutes, and the minutes into a frantic, heart-pounding hour of searching that yielded nothing but the sound of his own voice echoing off the ridges. The terrain around Spence Field drops off sharply into deep ravines and thickets of rhododendron, so dense they are known as mountain hells. These are places where a man can be 5 feet away and completely invisible, tangled in a web of woody stems and shadow. By the time the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, jagged shadows across the meadow, the realization had set in that Dennis was not coming back on his own. Then the sky opened up, and 3 inches of rain fell in a matter of hours, washing away any footprints or scent trails that might have guided the searchers to the boy. The search that followed was the largest in the history of the National Park Service, a massive mobilization of over 1,400 people, including park rangers, local volunteers, and eventually the military. But there was a strange, discordant energy to the operation from the very beginning, a sense that the authorities were looking for something more than just a lost child. Within days, the United States Army sent in the Green Berets, specialized combat troops who were seen carrying heavy weaponry and radio equipment that seemed overkill for a search and rescue mission. These men did not mingle with the civilian volunteers. They set up their own perimeter, conducted their own searches in areas deemed off-limits to the public, and left without filing a single public report. Why would the government deploy elite unconventional warfare specialists to look for a 7-year-old boy unless they suspected a threat that the public was not prepared to face? There is a testimony that often gets buried in the official accounts, a chilling report from a man named Harold Keaton, who was hiking with his family several miles away on the same afternoon Dennis vanished. Keaton reported hearing a blood-curdling, high-pitched scream that sounded like a child in agony coming from a ridge high above them. When he looked up, he saw a rough, disheveled man darting through the brush, carrying something over his shoulder that looked like a small body in a bright red shirt. Keaton was an experienced woodsman, and he described the man as looking wild, almost animalistic, moving through the nearly vertical terrain with an effortless speed that no human should possess. The Park Service dismissed the report, claiming the timing did not match, but the geographic location was a direct line from where Dennis had been playing. If you look at the topographical maps of that area, you start to see a pattern of limestone caves and deep underground fissures that honeycomb the entire mountain range. Some researchers suggest that there is a population of something living in those caves, a remnant of something ancient that has learned to stay out of the light. The Green Berets were rumored to be searching these cave entrances, using thermal imaging and seismic sensors to look for movement beneath the earth. There are whispers of underground facilities, of black helicopters seen hovering over the peaks without markings, and of a general sense of unease that permeated the entire search effort. The mud in those mountains is a thick clay-like substance that clings to your boots, making every step a labor of will, yet no tracks were ever found that belonged to Dennis. It was as if he had been plucked from the surface of the earth by a hand that left no footprint and made no sound. The logistics of the disappearance are what truly haunt the investigators who refuse to let the case go cold. A 7-year-old boy, even one as healthy as Dennis, could not have traveled the miles of rugged terrain required to reach the areas where the Green Berets were focusing their attention in the time allotted. The storm that hit that night brought temperatures down into the low 50s, a recipe for hypothermia that should have left a body behind within 24 hours. But no body was found, no scrap of red fabric, no small shoe lost in the mud, nothing but the endless mocking green of the forest. We are taught that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, but in the case of Dennis Martin there was only the action of a disappearance, and then a total void like silence. This lack of physical evidence is a recurring theme in these cases, a signature of something that operates outside our understanding of biology and physics. They want you to believe in the simple explanations, the bears or the mountain lions or the tragic falls into hidden crevices, but the details never fit the narrative. Bears do not meticulously remove a child's clothing and then leave it in a neat pile miles away on an inaccessible ledge. And mountain streams do not swallow human beings without leaving a single trace of DNA behind. There is a frequency to these woods, a low subsonic hum that some people claim to feel before something goes wrong, a vibration that signals the thinning of the veil between our world and something much hungrier. It is a predatory landscape, one that watches with 1,000 unseen eyes, waiting for that one moment of diverted attention. The Dennis Martin case is not an isolated incident. It is a blueprint for a phenomenon that has been repeating itself across the national parks of North America for over a century. In October of 1999, another tragedy mirrored the Martin case with terrifying precision in the Roosevelt National Forest of Colorado. 3-year-old Jaryd Atadero was hiking on a well-worn trail with a group of adults and older children trailing slightly behind the main group, but still within earshot. He stopped to talk to 2 fishermen near a bridge, and within the span of less than 4 minutes he vanished as if he had evaporated into the mountain air. The search for Jaryd was exhaustive, involving bloodhounds, helicopters, and hundreds of ground searchers who combed every square inch of the surrounding forest. The dogs, much like the dogs in the Dennis Martin case, were unable to pick up a scent, or in some instances they simply refused to enter certain areas, whining and tucking their tails in a display of primal fear. For 4 years, the Atadero family lived in a state of suspended animation, caught between the hope of a miracle and the crushing weight of the unknown. Then in May of 2003, hikers stumbled upon a scene that defied every law of logic and probability on a steep, nearly vertical cliffside, 550 feet above the trail where Jaryd was last seen. They found a pair of small jogging pants, a light blue fleece jacket, and a single shoe, all belonging to the boy who had vanished years before. The clothing was in remarkably good condition, not shredded by predators or bleached by the sun in a way that suggested it had been sitting on that ledge for 4 years. Most unsettling of all was the fact that the pants were found inside out, and there was no evidence of a body, no bones, no blood, nothing but a single tooth and a fragment of a skull. The official explanation was a mountain lion attack, but the mountain lion theory falls apart under the slightest bit of scrutiny from a forensic perspective. A mountain lion is a messy eater. It drags its prey to a secluded spot, leaving a trail of blood and fur, and it certainly does not turn its victim clothing inside out before consuming them. Furthermore, the location where the clothes were found was so high and so difficult to reach that a 3-year-old could never have climbed there on his own. The idea that a predator carried him up there without leaving a single drop of blood on the trail or the rocks is a fantasy designed to provide a neat ending to an untidy horror story. We are left with the image of those clothes sitting on a ledge like a grim trophy. A reminder that something took Jaryd and then placed his remains in a location where they were never meant to be found. When you look at these 2 cases side by side, the parallels are impossible to ignore, and the implications are deeply disturbing for anyone who values their safety in the wild. Both boys were young, both vanished in the presence of adults in a matter of seconds, and both cases involved a total lack of initial physical evidence despite massive search efforts. There is a sense of a deliberate, almost playful malice in the way these items are sometimes returned years later, in places that were previously searched. It is as if the predator or whatever force is behind these disappearances is mocking our attempts to understand its nature. We are dealing with something that can move through the forest without snapping a twig, something that can bypass our most sophisticated tracking methods, and something that has a specific interest in the young and the vulnerable. The theory of underground facilities, or a hidden population of hominids, begins to look less like science fiction and more like a necessary hypothesis when you face the reality of these files. There are thousands of miles of unexplored cave systems beneath our national parks, many of which are protected by federal law and restricted from public access. These are the dark places where the sun never reaches, where the temperature remains a constant, chilling 55 degrees, and where the echoes of the surface world are lost in the stone. If something were living down there, something with a high degree of intelligence and a predatory instinct, it would have the perfect vantage point to observe our movements and strike when the timing is right. The military presence in cases like Dennis Martin suggests that the people at the top of the chain of command are well aware of this possibility, even if they will never admit it to the tax-paying public. The air in this room is getting colder, and the shadows in the corners seem to be stretching, reaching toward the center of the desk where the maps are spread out. I think about Bill Martin, a father who spent his entire life and every penny he owned trying to find out what happened to his son in that brief window of time at Spence Field. I think about the way the forest looks at dusk when the trees turn into silhouettes and the wind starts to sound like a chorus of whispers. We are guests in the wilderness, and we are only allowed to stay as long as the shadows permit us to be there. The moment we stop paying attention, the moment we step off the designated path or let our guard down for a single heartbeat, we risk becoming another page in a folder that will never be closed. Dennis Martin and Jaryd Atadero are just two names in a ledger that grows longer with every passing season, a ledger written in the ink of unsolved mysteries and broken hearts. The red shirt of a boy in Tennessee and the inside-out pants of a child in Colorado are the only monuments to lives that were erased by a force we cannot name. We can talk about logistics and weather data until our voices fail us, but it will not bring them back, and it will not explain the silence that followed their disappearance. The earth is an old, hungry entity, and it does not distinguish between the innocent and the guilty, the young or the old when it decides to claim a prize. All that remains is the cold reality that some things are taken and never returned, kept by the shadows that dwell in the places we were never meant to go. The pattern of sudden trace-free disappearance is a wound that never heals, a reminder that the boundary between our world and the unknown is as thin as a mountain mist. In 1991, 8-year-old Thomas Bowman vanished while hiking with his family in the Arroyo Seco area of the Angeles National Forest, never to be seen again, despite being only yards away from his relatives. In 2010, a highly experienced hiker named Michael Fissery disappeared in Hetch Hetchy in Yosemite, leaving behind only his backpack and a sense of profound unease among the rangers who searched for him. These cases, along with the Martin and Atadero tragedies, suggest a predatory intelligence that is not bound by the geography of a single park or a single decade. Sleep well if you can, and remember that the woods are never as empty as they seem, and the silence you hear between the trees is often the sound of something watching you.